Whatsoever errors and intolerable abominations a sovereign prince commit, he ought to escape all punishment, as if thereby the world were only ordained for kings. Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about James VI of Scotland's The Trew Law of Free Monarchies, or the reciproc and mutual duty between a free king and his natural subjects. So this is James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England, but when he wrote The Trew Law of Free Monarchies in 1598, he was still King of Scotland and not yet King of England. So James VI. This piece came out, again, in 1598, so roughly the same time that Basilikon Doron came out. And while they're not exactly companion pieces, in these two works, James is covering fairly similar ground, right? So Basilikon Doron, this is a princely advice manual for James's son Henry. It is focused on how to be a good king, what you as king should be doing, and the sort of duties and responsibilities you should expect of others. Trew Law very much focuses on the latter of these 2 points. There is some discussion of how to be a good king, what good kings should do, and this sort of what I would call noblesse oblige, even though that term doesn't get coined for about 2 centuries, a little over 2 centuries, but there is some sense in the true law of free monarchies that the king has responsibilities, or a monarch has responsibilities to their subjects, but that's not primarily what James is interested in. What he's primarily interested in here is making an argument on behalf of absolute monarchy. Namely, the argument that under no philosophical principles, theological principles, historical principles, legal principles, practical principles, logical principles, etc., is it ever justified to rebel against your monarch. Can't do it. Doesn't matter. No justification whatsoever. Anybody who tells you there is ever a justification for rebelling against your monarch is wrong, according to James. And he does this with reference to a number of different sort of levels of argument, each of which fit pretty well within the sort of broad scope of Enlightenment thought. And James, and I'll point this out, James establishes this principle, this key principle, that you cannot ever rebel against your sovereign under any circumstances or for any reason, right from the start. The first line of the Trew Law, there's a little bit of a sort of preface thing, but the first actual proper line of it is, as there is not a thing so necessary to be known by the people of any land, next the knowledge of their God, as the right knowledge of their allegiance, according to the form of government established among them, especially in a monarchy, which form of government, as resembling the divinity, approacheth nearest to perfection, as all the learned and wise men from the beginning have agreed upon. So right from the start, you need to know your place. That is the gist of the Trew Law. And James approaches this on a number of levels. One, probably the one that he devotes the most page space to, is an argument from biblical precedent. So he points to a number of biblical passages, and he interprets them in a particular way that justifies the authority of a monarch, and undercuts any sort of challenges, questions, certainly any sort of revolutionary activity, but undercuts any challenges, to the point where even sort of complaining about the monarch is questionably against God's will. So he says here, after citing a number of these Bible passages and slightly elucidating them to explain how he draws his conclusions, this is, I think he's talking about a passage from the book of Samuel here. And what James says is, as if he would say, the best and noblest of your blood shall be compelled in slavish and servile offices to serve him, that being the king. And then a little bit later, he after another passage, he says, although you shall grudge and murmur, yet it shall not be lawful to you to cast it off. That is the authority of the monarch. In respect, it is not only the ordinance of God, but also yourselves have chosen him unto you, thereby renouncing forever all privileges, by your willing consent out of your hands, whereby in any time hereafter you would claim and call back unto yourselves again that power which God shall not permit you to do. So this is an interesting one because, this is built out of an interpretation of the Bible story in which the Israelites, they've been sort of taken along under the judges, and they go to God and they say, we want a king, give us a king. And God says, all right, I will give you a king, but you can never, basically God says, no take backs. Like, if I give you a king, you have to have a king forever. You are deciding this for yourselves and your children, etc., etc. Now, the reason that this is interesting is not an especially interesting reading of the biblical passage, but the reason that it's interesting is because around this same time, really slightly later than this, when you get more toward the period of the English Civil War in the 1640s, you have this development of an idea called the social contract, right? People like John Locke started elucidating this. He's one of the first major philosophers to really start kicking this idea around. But basically, the idea of the social contract, I think especially in Locke, whereas people like Rousseau are a little more skeptical of this, but for Locke, he's basically like, yeah, when you are part of a society, you agree to give up some of your individual liberty in exchange for the benefits of being in that society. And that social contract exists even if you did not personally agree to it. You are still bound by it simply by virtue of existing within a society, whether you want to or not. So James is actually making the same kind of argument here, that it doesn't actually matter if you have consented to live under a monarchy, because the nature of the social order consents on your behalf. There's a sort of automatic, it's like you have to click accept terms and conditions in order to live in this society. But you also sort of don't get a choice to not click it. Like, it's not just a question of you can't use this software, or in this case, this society, if you don't click accept terms and conditions. It's literally, there is no other option to not do it. You have automatically done it. You have automatically accepted the terms and conditions, and you can't get out of it. So we've got that element. So the biblical part is a big part of what James argues. And this, again, this is a very sort of early modern Enlightenment era type thing, because it is in reference to a form of authority that for centuries would have been considered one of the most important forms of authority. But as you start getting further and further into the early modern period and into the Enlightenment especially, biblical authority decreases. and rationality, logic, these kinds of things become more important. And James does not leave those things out. So the next thing that he appeals to after his discussion of the religious foundations for absolute monarchy is history, Scottish history specifically. And basically he argues that there were kings in Scotland before there were parliaments, and so Parliament has limited authority to control the power of the king, and that the history of Scotland is a history of the power of monarchy. He next takes on a sort of legal argument, the question of whether or not the king is bound by the law. Of course, an incredibly important question. Recently, in the US, somewhat resurrected by the Supreme Court, except we don't have a monarchy. We have a president who, according to the Constitution, is actually supposed to be bound by the law. But the current iteration of the Supreme Court apparently doesn't give a shit about that. James would approve. The framers of the US Constitution probably not so much, but that's neither here nor there. So James does talk about this question of the law, and this is one of his logical arguments, taking us into these modes of Enlightenment thought. So he says here, "For although it be true that I have at length proved that the king is above the law, as both the author and giver of strength thereto, yet a good king will not only delight to rule his subjects by the law, but even will conform himself in his own actions thereunto. Always keep that ground, that the health of the commonwealth be his chief law." So again, this is one of those things. James does have these moments of noblesse oblige kind of focus, and this question of what it means to be a good king. One of the elements of being a good king being that you rule according to the law, that you are sort of moderate in the way that you enforce punishments, that you restrict your own rampant criminality, etc., etc. So we do get these things. But again, this is also a logical argument that king's authority, that the law's authority comes from the king, and therefore the king can't be bound by the law. Therefore, it doesn't actually matter if the king breaks the law, or more accurately, the king can't break the law. It doesn't make logical sense to even argue that the king has broken the law because the king is outside the law. This is actually Charles I, James's son, would eventually resurrect a form of this argument when he was being tried for treason during the English Civil War. Charles would argue that treason is by definition against the king, and so there's no way that he as king could commit treason. If you are the source and authority of the law, then you may be outside the law. This is James's argument here, and therefore, even if you do stuff that's illegal for others, you aren't bound by that. You cannot be held accountable. James then sort of makes another logical argument, another argument based in reason or rationality, basically that a superior can never overthrow or judge, or an inferior can never overthrow or judge a superior. Whether we want to accept that logic or not, James certainly puts forward that argument that, say, a school child can never overrule or judge their teacher. That a prisoner on trial can never overrule or judge the magistrate, whatever it is. And often within the structures of social order, this makes perfect sense. So James sort of extrapolates that logic. If everybody in the realm is subject to is a subject of the monarch, none of them could overrule or judge that monarch. And then so the last major point that James makes that I want to talk about, I think this is a really tenuous one, right? Like the question of whether or not those with less authority can ever challenge those with more authority, that's a debatable point. But this last one I'm going to talk about, I think, is really, really questionable. There's two things that James says here. Basically, he says, so at one point he does say, if you have a bad king, that's your punishment from God. You need to shape up and be better as a society. But he then comes back to this question of bad monarchs. So he says, for a king cannot be imagined to be so unruly and tyrannous, but the commonwealth will be kept in better order, notwithstanding thereof, by him, than it can be by his way taking. And then slightly after that, he says, and next, it is certain that a king can never be so monstrously vicious that he will generally favor justice and maintain some order, except in the particulars wherein his inordinate lusts and passions carry him away, whereby to the contrary no king being, nothing is unlawful to none. So basically what James says here is, yeah, even though some kings are terrible, it's not possible that a king will be so terrible, so unruly, so unlawful, so autocratic that the kingdom would be better off without the monarch's guiding influence. Partially this is because James does not really consider other potential social systems, but there definitely is an element in which, especially for short periods after the fall of a monarch or an absolute ruler or a dictator or whatever it is, there often is chaos, right? That's typically, though, a short-term condition. And often when you have a stable government of some kind that replaces that condition will end. But again, James doesn't sort of consider that as a possibility. He's really only concerned with monarchy and the absolute power of the monarch.